the American who knows the most about Gandhi's life and about non-violent direct action in Satyagraha is a man called James Lawson.
Was he able to successfully implement the non-violent
Very much
methods in
so.
the civil rights movement?
There are many similarities, by the way,
Uh-huh.
in Lawson's own personal life and Gandhi's personal life.
Did the African American struggle for civil rights, did it teach non-violence to the world?
He never found Gandhi so excited in welcoming visitors as he was when these African Americans came to visit him in 1936.
Was it common for a lot of the developing world at that time to come to India for getting political inspiration?
James Lawson and King both opposed America's Vietnam War.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Indian Express. We all know that Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of non-violent resistance has shaped so much in India. But when Gandhi was conceiving his idea of Satyagraha, he scarcely knew that decades later, a Methodist pastor all the way in America would be teaching his methods to a generation of civil rights activists in the country. I'm talking about a gentleman named James Lawson, whom we hardly ever come across in the history of the civil rights movement as we read it today. Hello, I'm Adrija Roychowdhury, and we would be discussing this gentleman who happens to be the subject of this new book called James Lawson, Teacher of Satyagraha. It is also the first biography of this civil rights activist who was incredibly well known back in the 50s and 60s. There's very little we know about him today. To discuss the life of James Lawson, I have with me the author of this book, Mr. Rajmohan Gandhi, who needs very little introduction, of course. Mr. Gandhi, as we know, is an author, a biographer. He has written over 15 books. He says that this is his 16th book and at present his most favorite one. Welcome to Indian Express, sir.
Thank you very much, Adrija. Thank you.
So, to begin with, can you tell our audiences who is Mr. James Lawson?
Well, James Lawson died 2 years ago, 2024. Uh, he was one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s closest, most valued associates. He was 1 year older than King, by the way. King died in 1968 at the age of 39. This man, James Lawson, who was 1 year older than King, was alive until 2024. And in the 1950s and 1960s, James Lawson was an exceedingly well-known figure in the United States. He was a radical fighter for justice, for equality for the African Americans, absolutely committed, passionately committed to nonviolence. He had studied Gandhi's life when he was in school, when he was in college, and then when he was in India for 3 years, in the 1950s, he spent 3 years in Nagpur, close to Wardha and Sevagram, studying Gandhi's life. And he became easily one of the best scholars of Gandhi. But apart from that, he became possibly the most respected teacher of nonviolent direct action in the 1950s and 1960s in the south of the United States, in Tennessee, in Georgia, in Mississippi, in Alabama, in much of the South. So as I said, he was exceedingly well known at that time. But then the 60s were a long time ago.
Yeah.
And great positive legislation emerged in the 1960s during President Johnson's presidency. And many reforms, radical reforms were made. But then the world's interest went to other matters, including in the United States. But you can be sure that that James Lawson will be discussed. I mean, mine is the first book on him, but many more books will come out because he was an extraordinary figure in so many different ways.
Okay. So, how did you come across Mr. James Lawson? How were you introduced to him?
So in the 1980s, already it's about 40 or 50 years ago, a remarkable American professor called James Laue, L-A-U-E, was a white American academic, but very much interested in US history and in the African American history. He told me, we happened to meet he told me that the American who knows the most about Gandhi's life and about nonviolent direct action and satyagraha is a man called James Lawson. So I wanted to meet him, but circumstances never made that possible. But it was only in 2019, just at the start of the pandemic,
Yeah.
that I met Reverend James Lawson, although I was teaching in the United States for many years. So I met him then, and he very kindly agreed that I could write his story of his life, and he made available all kinds of documents and papers. And I went to the place where he was born, went to the school where he studied, the college where he studied, and University of Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee, which is where he studied for some time, which is where he uh, inspired many of the professors and the students to take part in nonviolent direct action, where he was dismissed and where he was arrested. That is where today, so many decades later, his papers are stored.
Okay.
The university apologized to James Lawson, unveiled his portrait in a very important part of their campus. Vanderbilt is a very famous university in the US. So there is a very important James Lawson chair also at Vanderbilt today. He is highly honored at the university, which expelled him in 1960.
Okay. All right. All right. That's very fascinating. And how did James Lawson come across Gandhi's teachings?
Well, he came across Gandhi's work when he was reading African American newspapers as a schoolboy. He was in a place called Massillon, Ohio, which is not far from Cleveland and Columbus, the great cities of the state of Ohio, in the eastern part of the United States. And so in his school, he read about Gandhi. In his college, he studied Gandhi. And, and this was before Gandhi was killed. And he was in college when he heard the news of Gandhi's assassination. And there was a remarkable white professor called Muste, M-U-S-T-E, from whom he had heard in detail about Gandhi's work. This was in 47, before Gandhi was killed. So he made up his mind that he would study Gandhi. Then he was imprisoned because he did not believe in signing up and entering, becoming a soldier in the US Army. He was opposed to that.
Okay.
He was sent to prison for that. In prison, he studied Gandhi some more. In prison, he also made plans for what he would do for nonviolent direct action in the United States. And then, after he was released, he did spend 3 years in India. And he was convinced that nonviolent direct action could take place in the United States before it actually took place. And so when Martin Luther King and this remarkable lady who led the campaign against discrimination in buses in the southern states. So Lawson was excited by that, and he soon joined that campaign. He intensified that campaign, and according to Martin Luther King, he became the best trader, the best strategist of nonviolent direct action in the United States.
So was he able to successfully implement the non-violent
Very much
methods
so.
in the civil rights movement?
Very much so.
Okay.
And the sit-ins, as they were called, when young African Americans would go to segregated restaurants where they were not allowed to sit or eat. So they sat, and the police came. They were roughed up, they were pushed out, they were jeered at, they were beaten, but they remained nonviolent, and they were arrested. And so when all this happened, when the brutality of the repression of nonviolent direct action took place, that is when America learned, the rest of America, this racialism was much stronger in the South than in the North. It also existed in the North, much stronger in the South. But when nonviolent activists trained by Lawson, young people who afterwards became very famous, by the way, one of the most famous students of James Lawson was a US House of Representatives man called John Lewis, who died in 2022, I think.
Okay.
Remarkable man, a very great man. He has written in his autobiography, he writes about how James Lawson had trained him. So when in the late 1950s and early 1960s, nonviolent direct action was countered by brutal repression. That is when the rest of the United States understood the depth of racial segregation and racial injustice in the US. And that is when many in the US also learned and discovered the power of nonviolent direct action.
Okay. So you're saying that, James Lawson is somebody who is very much responsible for the understanding of non-violent action in America.
Understanding and implementation, and how in practice you could implement it.
Okay.
How you could be trained for nonviolent direct action. If you are beaten, if you are insulted, how should you react? All those details were anticipated and explained and taught by James Lawson to those who were willing to enter the struggle.
Okay. But I mean, I've also read about the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. himself was also very much inspired by Gandhi. How would you say that, were both James Lawson and Martin Luther King also collaborating on Gandhian methods?
Yes, they were. So when they first met in 1956, after Lawson had returned to America after 3 years in Nagpur, and Martin Luther King was excited. He said, I want to go to India also. I want to see the land where Gandhi's struggle, nonviolent struggle, was apparently so effective. King did come to India, but after some years later, in 1959. And King's account of his time in India also extremely interesting. And there's a very famous speech he made shortly after he returned to America about nonviolent direct action, about Gandhi, which is available. Scholars can find it. So they both were independent scholars of Gandhi, although Lawson was a bit ahead of King in studying it in greater depth. But they were both absolutely united in trying to see how to spread nonviolent direct action, or satyagraha, as Lawson was perfectly willing to use that expression even in the United States. And they both collaborated in doing that. They were very close allies. They were very different. One big difference was that Martin Luther King was a Southerner.
Okay.
And as I mentioned earlier, it was the US South which was the center of this segregation practice. Lawson was raised in Ohio, which is in the northeastern part of the United States. He was also a pastor. Now, whereas King was a Baptist pastor, Lawson was a Methodist pastor. So in some ways, that also is a noticeable distinction. I must also, however, say that Lawson had his own original, you might say, independent interpretation of Christianity. He was not an orthodox interpreter of the Christian teaching. So he was courageous enough to give his own interpretation of Christianity. He remained a devout Christian, but he gave and he had a respect for Hinduism, for Islam, for Judaism, for non-Christian religions very strongly. So he was very much like Gandhi there also. In fact, there are many similarities, by the way, in Lawson's own personal life and Gandhi's personal life. And some of these I have referred to in this book.
Yes. Can you give a few examples, though, sir? How were they similar?
Well, when Lawson was in prison for nearly 3 years, from 50 to 53, there were some fellow prisoners who tried to provoke him, who tried even to assault him. And he was wondering how he would resist this non-violently. And, in Gandhi's life, when he was in South Africa from 1893 to 2014, there were several times he went to prison there. In some of his imprisonments in South Africa, Gandhi writes that his fellow prisoners tried to assault him. And the dilemmas that Gandhi faced and that Lawson faced in prison on how to give a non-violent response to those who try to attack you are extremely interesting, and I mentioned in this book.
So I found there's a statement in your book in which you write that in the year 1936, Gandhi had sensed in his village thousands of miles away from America the potential power of the African American
Yeah,
struggle,
yeah,
which
yeah,
is this is at least around 2 decades before the civil rights movement, and Gandhi is reflecting on the
yeah, yeah,
potential of the
yeah,
African
yeah,
American
yeah, yeah,
struggle, which I found very interesting.
yeah.
So, can you explain this a little bit?
Yes,
Like, why was he so moved by what he saw in the power of the African American
that's a
struggle?
great question you ask. So in 1936, Gandhi was then out of prison. He was wondering what next to do. He was in a place called Bardoli in Gujarat,
Hmm.
not very far from his ashram in Ahmedabad.
Hmm.
He was in Bardoli, and about 4 or 5 African Americans, led by a very remarkable man called Howard Thurman, Thurman,
Hmm.
went to meet Gandhi in Bardoli.
Hmm.
They had heard about Gandhi's work, and they felt, by the way, it's important to note that from 1920 onwards, African Americans of various kinds in different parts of the United States felt that if Gandhi is able to shake the British Empire in India,
Hmm.
why shouldn't the African Americans learn something from Gandhi's method? So this was
Okay.
a widespread, you might say, conversation among thinkers of African Americans.
Okay.
So Howard Thurman, who afterwards became a very famous professor, scholar, teacher, philosopher,
Hmm.
Howard Thurman. So anyway, he was in India in 36 with some other African Americans. And Mahadev Desai, Gandhi's close associate, was
Hmm.
secretary. He wrote at that time that he never found Gandhi so excited in welcoming visitors as he was when these African Americans came to visit him in 1936. And then they had a very long conversation. How do we apply nonviolence? If there is lynching of African Americans, how do we apply nonviolence? Various conversations of that kind. And then they also spoke of their struggles, and Gandhi asked them to sing some of their spirituals. You know,
Hmm.
the African
Hmm.
American
Hmm.
spirituals are a wonderful form both of music and a form of teaching and of mobilizing people. So after that long conversation, when Gandhi was quizzing them on what kind of problems they face, he asked, is intermarriage allowed between whites and blacks?
Hmm.
And many other questions, very practical, detailed questions. He got answers. They asked him how to apply nonviolence. They got answers. At the end of that 3 hour conversation, I think, Gandhi wrote in his journal, in his newspaper, magazine, that he expects some great things to come from the African Americans, that they will probably teach nonviolent direct action better than anybody else. This is what Gandhi wrote. You can find it in Gandhi's collected works in 1936.
And do you believe that that is true? Did the African American struggle for civil rights, did it teach non-violence to the world?
It did. You know that in the 1980s, when in Eastern Europe the Soviet Empire started to collapse, and there were many actions or processions or demonstrations against authoritarianism, dictatorship in East Europe.
Hmm.
One of their heroes was Martin Luther King Jr., and they referred to non-violent direct action. They also spoke of Gandhi, but they spoke a lot about Martin Luther King Jr. So all over the world, we know that Martin Luther King, even in India, you know, in different parts of India, if you sometimes you've run into youth groups who will sing, "We shall overcome."
Yes, yes,
Hum
yes,
honge kamyab.
yes.
That is a civil rights song.
Oh,
Yes,
okay, okay,
connected
okay.
with the associates of
Ah,
Martin Luther King and of James
ah,
Lawson.
okay, okay. That's very interesting. Also I found it quite interesting. When you write about James Lawson's time in Nagpur.
Yeah,
That's a very nice
yeah,
chapter. I thought,
yeah,
where
yeah.
you're writing, and I was quite surprised to know that there were other African Americans in Nagpur at that time,
Not so many African Americans, but Africans.
but Africans.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. You know, the African students had started coming to India after independence.
Hmm. Okay.
Bombay, Pune, Delhi, even Nagpur. So they were African students because Africa's independence came some years after India's independence,
Yeah, yeah,
and they
yeah.
took inspiration from India's independence, and they thought that education in India would help them uh, to do their work in their own African countries. So there was a group, I don't know how many, but James Lawson met these African students in Nagpur, and then on his way back to the US, he spent many weeks in Africa, which also I describe
Yes,
in this book.
yes, 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 yes. That also I found
Yeah,
very interesting. So there are these very, fascinating links that is happening over here, and
yeah.
it is also happening at a time after Gandhi.
Yes, yes,
Yeah, yeah,
very true.
yes. So, I mean, what I wanted to ask you was it common for a lot of the developing world at that time to come to India for getting political inspiration?
Absolutely, my goodness, yes. There was the Asian Relations Conference already in 1947. There was the African Asian movement. There was the non-aligned movement. There was the
Yeah.
so much attempts at solidarity between Asian countries and African countries because
Hmm.
white supremacy was a reality and something that people in Asia and Africa did not like. They wanted
Hmm.
equality.
And could you tell our audiences why was James Lawson in India for those 3 years? How did he land up in
Well,
Nagpur?
James Lawson had spent 3 years in prison. He was released. Uh, he wanted to become a Methodist minister, uh, and the Methodist Church
Mm-hmm.
in the United States
Hmm.
suggested that he should have some training and experience in India. Now, the college to which he went in Nagpur is called Hislop College, Hislop. It's still there.
Okay.
It was started by the British.
Hmm.
It is a Protestant college. It was not a Methodist college. But because James Lawson had been trained to work, he had not yet got his uh, degree as a pastor, but he was trying to become a pastor. So the Methodists sent him uh, to teach, but also he was a sporting coach. He taught sporting teams in Nagpur, and this will interest your readers. He trained many young Indians in basketball. Basketball is an American sport, not
Yeah.
yet so popular in India. But at that time, in the mid 50s, he trained many teams in basketball because he was, among other things, he was a good sportsman too. And they went to Calcutta, they went to South India, they went to Delhi with basketball teams. So, among other things, he also, yeah, he spread basketball in India.
Okay. So he took non-violence from India and he spread basketball in India.
Yes, yeah.
All right. Um, I mean, again, I'll go back to where we started from. Given how key he was to the civil rights movement and to the spread of Gandhian philosophy, why is it that we know so little of him?
Well, there are many reasons for that, but at least now there is a chance to know
Yeah, of
more
course.
more about him.
Yeah.
There's so many things that happen, and we get fascinated by, interested in so many things. But there's something that uh, I should mention about both Lawson and Martin Luther King. As some people already have forgotten, but they should not forget, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee
Hmm.
in 1968.
Mm-hmm.
Why was he in Memphis, Tennessee? Lawson invited him to Memphis, Tennessee. Why did Lawson invite King to Memphis, Tennessee? Because there was a strike led by the garbage workers of Memphis, garbage cleaners.
Okay.
And there were thousands of them, and they were very badly treated. They were all African American.
Hmm.
They were very badly treated. And Lawson decided to organize them, teach them satyagraha, teach them nonviolence. And he decided to invite King to strengthen his instruction, to strengthen his effort in Memphis. So King, on his visits to Memphis, finally was assassinated in Memphis. So for Lawson, this was a very deep and painful realization that his invitation resulted in King ultimately being assassinated.
Yeah.
So Lawson had to live with that truth
Hmm.
that his invitation, which King accepted, ultimately led to a racial conspiracy to kill King in Memphis,
Yeah.
Tennessee. But this is another important element in Lawson's story, which tells us also of the, you might say, the pain and the struggle of his life.
So I'll end this interview with my final question is that, we know that we are in a state of several global conflicts right now. And in this kind of a global atmosphere, how do you think we should be remembering somebody like James Lawson and, of course, Gandhi's teachings as well?
Well, I must mention that James Lawson and King
Hmm.
both opposed America's Vietnam War. So, is there any doubt that Lawson today would
Yeah.
have opposed Trump's war on Iran?
Yes. All right, sir. Thank you so much. And congratulations on your yet another book, on your 16th book, as you mentioned. I look forward to reading many more written by you.
Thank you very much.
To listen to more such conversations on history, culture, politics, and more, please do subscribe to the Indian Express.